I've always prided myself on being a patient wife, someone who gives her husband the benefit of the doubt, who trusts him fully. But recently something's changed. It's a feeling like the slow burn of a fire that you don't notice at first, but that eventually consumes everything in its path. I've started noticing the little things, the subtle shifts in the air when he talks about her, the way he seems eager to leave the house whenever she calls. It started innocently enough, or at least that's how he made it seem. He would mention his old friend, Lydia, who lived just a few doors down. "I'm helping her out with some repairs," he'd say, as if it was just a favor, nothing more. Lydia, this woman I barely knew, had apparently lived in the neighborhood for years, but I'd never really interacted with her much. She was friendly enough, but there was something in the way she smiled at him that I couldn't quite place. I wasn't one to question him. I trusted him, or at least I thought I did. But over the past few months, I began to notice that his visits to her house grew longer, more frequent. I would sit at home waiting for him to return, the silence of our home stretching between us. It was on one of those evenings after he came home late that I started piecing things together. When he walked in, his eyes were a little too bright, his smile a little too rehearsed. His shirt was wrinkled, his hair slightly out of place. He said nothing about his late arrival, nothing about the time he spent there. The only thing he mentioned was that Lydia's place was coming along, that she'd bought a new couch, and that it looked great. But it wasn't just the late nights that bothered me. It was the little things, the way he seemed to talk about her as if she were more than just a neighbor, more than just a friend in need of help. He would come home from his visits with a different kind of energy, like he was recharged, refreshed. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was becoming a distant memory to him, a wife who was just there. It wasn't until one afternoon, a few weeks later, that I decided I couldn't sit back and wait for the truth to come to me. I had to take control. So I waited for my chance. It came on a Saturday when the weather was warm enough for a walk around the block. I had been getting ready to go out, but then as I was tying my shoes, I heard the familiar sound of the doorbell. When I opened the door, there she was, Lydia. "Hey, I'm so sorry to bother you," she said, her voice sweet, but there was an edge to it, something sharp behind those wide, innocent eyes. "I'm having a problem with the sink. Would you mind if I came in for a minute? I don't want to disturb your husband. I know he's busy." The moment she said it, my heart sank. I'd never really spent any time with Lydia, but I'd heard enough from my husband about her to know that she didn't need any help fixing a sink. I smiled, trying to hide the tightness in my chest. "Of course, come in," I said, stepping aside. She walked in, looking around the living room with a practiced glance, as if she were familiar with the space. I couldn't help but notice how she seemed to linger in the spots where my husband had touched, where his presence still lingered. The tension in the air was thick, suffocating. "I'm sorry to interrupt," she said again, her voice feigning modesty. "But I really didn't want to wait until he got home. I know how busy he can get. And you? Well, you've always been so kind." I couldn't help but smile at her words, though the bitterness simmered just beneath the surface. "It's no problem at all," I replied, my tone more clipped than I intended. "I think I've heard enough about your renovations to know how hard it's been for you." Her eyes flickered almost imperceptibly, but I saw it. The shift. She wasn't used to being confronted so directly. "Yes," she said, her smile faltering slightly. "It's been a lot of work. But it's nothing compared to the support he's given me. He's always so helpful." I could feel the heat rising in my chest, the anger that had been slowly brewing. "I'm glad he's been there for you," I said, forcing a smile. "I just wish he'd be as helpful at home." Lydia seemed to pick up on the undercurrent in my voice, but she brushed it off with a quick laugh, a laugh that didn't reach her eyes. "Well, you know how men are," she said, her tone light, almost too light. "They get so distracted by their work. But I can tell he really cares about you." I almost choked on the words. "Cares? Does he?" I let the question hang in the air, my heart pounding in my ears. For a moment, Lydia was silent, her eyes searching mine, like she was weighing something in her mind. Then finally she spoke. He's always said how much he appreciates you, how lucky he is. I'm sure he'd never do anything to hurt you." I wanted to believe her. But in that moment, I realized that the woman standing before me wasn't as innocent as she seemed. She wasn't here to fix a sink, and she wasn't just some helpful neighbor. She was a woman who had been slipping into my life, into my marriage, in ways I hadn't fully understood until now. And she knew exactly how to play her part: sweet, apologetic, and just a little too comfortable in my space. I forced myself to smile, but the mask felt brittle. "Well, I'll let you get to it," I said, stepping back toward the door. "But just so you know, if you ever need anything, you can always ask me. You're not alone, Lydia." Her smile wavered for a fraction of a second, but it was enough for me to see the cracks. She was trying to hide something, and I had caught her off guard. As she left, I stood in the doorway watching her walk down the steps, the feeling in my chest heavier than before. I didn't need more proof. I already knew what I had to do next. I wasn't going to stand by anymore and watch my husband drift further away. I wasn't going to let Lydia, this woman who had quietly wormed her way into my life, take what was mine. Whatever was going on between them, I was going to find out the truth. It was time to take matters into my own hands. This marriage wasn't going to slip through my fingers without a fight. I couldn't sleep that night. The quiet of the house felt suffocating, like the walls were closing in on me. My mind raced with thoughts I couldn't shut out, memories of my husband and I together before everything had begun to shift. I had always considered our marriage strong, built on trust and mutual respect. But now, after everything I had seen, I couldn't help but wonder if that trust had been misplaced. I thought about the way he talked about Lydia, how he lit up when he mentioned her name, how the visits had increased from a simple favor to something far more regular, as if they were starting to share a secret life together, one I wasn't part of. I couldn't ignore the fact that every time he came home from her house, he seemed to be in a better mood, like he had something to look forward to, something that wasn't me. The thought gnawed at me, eating away at the edges of my sanity. Could it be? Was my husband, the man I had shared everything with, really betraying me? And if so, how had I not seen it? How had I not noticed the signs earlier? By morning, I knew I couldn't let it go any longer. I needed answers, and I needed them now. The problem was I didn't know where to start. I couldn't just come out and accuse him. That would push him away, and it would be a mess neither of us was ready for. But I wasn't about to sit idly by and let things continue the way they had been. I had to take control. So I started paying closer attention. I watched his movements, the little things that seemed out of place. I listened for the change in his tone when he talked about Lydia, and I noticed the subtle way his eyes seemed to brighten whenever he mentioned her. But what struck me most was how defensive he had become about her. He would often brush off my questions about her with a quick "nothing to worry about," or a distracted, "she's just a neighbor." But there was always a hesitation in his voice, like he was trying to convince both me and himself that everything was fine. One afternoon I decided to act. I waited until he was out of the house, heading off on one of his trips to help Lydia with yet another project. I didn't even know what it was this time, painting a wall, fixing a faucet, who knew? But I had had enough. I slipped on my shoes and left the house, walking down the street toward Lydia's place. The plan was simple. I was going to see for myself what kind of relationship she and my husband had. I had to know. If I was wrong, if I was just overthinking things, I would have my peace of mind. But if I was right, well, I would finally have the truth. Lydia's house was just a few doors down. It was a small, quaint cottage with ivy creeping up the sides, giving it a cozy, almost inviting feel. But today, as I approached it, it felt more like a house of secrets than a place of comfort. I stood across the street for a few minutes, watching for any signs of movement. The blinds were drawn, and there was no sound coming from inside. It was quiet, too quiet. I felt a knot tighten in my stomach as I crossed the street, my heart racing. I didn't have a plan. I didn't know what I was going to do when I knocked on her door. I didn't even know if she was home. But something inside me urged me forward, telling me that I had to find out, that I couldn't leave things hanging in the air any longer. I rang the doorbell and waited. My palms were clammy, my breath shallow. I told myself it would be fine, that I was just going to ask some questions, nothing more. But when the door opened and Lydia stood before me, I could feel my pulse quicken. She looked surprised to see me, her wide eyes darting quickly over me before settling on my face. "Hi there," she said, her voice smooth and friendly. Too friendly. "What can I do for you?" I forced a smile. Lydia. I just wanted to stop by and, well, I've been meaning to catch up with you. I don't think we've ever really had the chance to talk, you know? My husband and I are pretty busy, and we haven't spent much time with you. I thought we could maybe. I hesitated, the words getting stuck in my throat. What was I even trying to say? I had come here for answers, not to make small talk. Lydia's smile faltered for a split second, but it quickly returned, even brighter. That sounds nice. I'd love to chat. Come on in. I stepped inside, trying to keep my composure. The interior of her house was decorated with a cozy, almost bohemian style. Throw pillows, rugs, and shelves full of books. It looked lived in, but somehow perfectly curated. It was exactly the kind of home a woman might decorate to feel like she had a space to herself, a place to unwind from the world. We sat down in the living room, and she offered me a cup of tea, which I accepted out of politeness. I was aware of the slight tension in the air, the unease between us. She was trying to seem casual, but there was something forced about it. Something about her seemed off, like she was trying a little too hard to seem innocent. So, how's everything going with the house? I asked, trying to sound nonchalant, even though my insides were screaming. Good, good, Lydia replied, her voice light but with an undertone of something darker. It's a lot of work, but I'm getting there. I'm lucky to have a friend like your husband, who's so willing to help out. I noticed the way she said friend, like she was trying to make it sound innocent, but I could hear the double meaning behind it. She wasn't talking about him as a friend in the way I would think of a friend. She was speaking about him as someone more, someone she was deeply familiar with. I forced a smile. I'm glad he's been there for you, I said, keeping my tone steady. He's a good guy, always willing to lend a hand. There was a flicker of something in Lydia's eyes, something that almost looked like guilt. But she quickly masked it, her smile widening. Yeah, well, I think it's more than just helping with repairs. He's been so kind, really. Always checking in, making sure everything's okay. My breath caught in my throat. That wasn't just a casual statement. It was a clue. A little piece of the puzzle that was finally starting to make sense. I needed to press further. I had to know just how deep this went. He does seem to enjoy spending time with you, I said carefully, watching her reaction closely. He talks about you often, about all the work you're doing here. Her eyes shifted quickly, just enough for me to notice. There it was again, the crack in her mask. She cleared her throat. Well, he's always been a bit of a workaholic. But I think he just enjoys being useful, you know? I nodded, my gaze not leaving hers. I suppose. But I'm not sure if he realizes how much time he's spending here lately. He hardly has time for me anymore. The silence between us grew thick, like the tension was suffocating both of us. I couldn't tell if Lydia was nervous or if she just didn't care. She didn't answer immediately, and when she did, her voice was softer, almost too soft. You're his wife, right? He loves you. I'm sure he just gets caught up in helping me out. Sometimes people just need someone to rely on. Don't you think? The way she said it, the way her words hung in the air. It was as if she was trying to convince me that it was all innocent, that I was just being paranoid. But I wasn't stupid. I could see the truth behind her eyes, the way she looked at me with pity, like I was the last to know. I stood up then, my pulse pounding in my ears. It was clear now. There was something going on between them, something I couldn't ignore any longer. I should go, I said, my voice tight with restraint. But thank you for the tea, Lydia. I think we'll be talking again soon. She stood up too, her smile still in place, but it didn't reach her eyes. Of course, she said, her voice sounding rehearsed. Take care. As I walked out of her house, I felt the weight of everything pressing down on me. I had the answers I'd been searching for, but now I had to figure out what to do with them. The walk back home felt like I was carrying the weight of the world on my shoulders. My thoughts swirled around my head, fragments of everything I had just learned colliding in a dizzying spiral. I couldn't escape the image of Lydia's eyes, soft but sharp, like a predator disguised as a lamb. And her words kept echoing in my mind, replaying over and over. He loves you. I'm sure he just gets caught up in helping me out. But it wasn't just helping her out anymore, was it? It wasn't just a neighborly favor. I could feel it in my gut, the way she spoke about him, the way she framed it all as so innocent when deep down I knew better. There was something between them. There had to be. By the time I reached my front door, I was numb, almost mechanical. I unlocked it, stepping inside without a single thought about the mess. The clothes, the papers scattered around. I didn't care. I went straight to the living room and collapsed onto the couch, running my fingers through my hair, my mind racing in frantic circles. How long had this been going on? How many times had he been there when I thought he was at work, when I was busy doing other things? I had seen the little signs, his distant looks when we were together, his short answers to my questions. But I had always brushed them off as nothing, convinced myself I was imagining things, convincing myself that he was just stressed or tired or overwhelmed. Maybe I was trying too hard to believe that everything was still as it had been. But now the pieces had fallen into place. There was no denying it. I wasn't being paranoid. My husband was having an affair with my neighbor, and all this time I had been blind to it. I hadn't even suspected anything beyond the surface level, hadn't realized the truth was sitting right under my nose, whispering to me in the form of late nights, strange excuses, and the way Lydia's name slipped too easily from his lips. I sat there for what felt like hours, running through every conversation, every look, every gesture he had made over the past few months. How he had laughed when I asked about her. How he had brushed off my concerns with a soft, distracted smile. How he had stopped paying attention to me. How his hands had grown less gentle, less eager to touch me. All of it now felt like a cruel joke. I didn't know what to do with myself. I couldn't confront him yet, not with everything still so raw, so fresh. I needed to think, to gather myself. But the anger was already building, bubbling beneath the surface, threatening to erupt. It was like a fire I couldn't put out, a storm that had already begun to rage. The thought of confronting him now, of calling him out on everything, almost seemed too easy. Part of me wanted to lash out, to make him feel the same hurt, the same betrayal that was crushing me from the inside. But another part of me, the part that had spent years loving him, building a life with him, felt a deep aching sorrow. How could he do this? How could he throw it all away for her? For a woman who had invaded our home, who had wormed her way into his life while I was none the wiser. But no, I couldn't let him get away with this. I couldn't let him think I was just going to sit back and let it happen. If he thought I would just accept this, he was gravely mistaken. I had already let him take so much, my trust, my happiness, my peace of mind, but now I was going to take back control. I knew what I had to do next. I had to make him see, make him understand that I wasn't going to play the fool any longer. The door creaked open behind me, snapping me out of my spiraling thoughts. I didn't need to look up to know who it was. My heart seemed to stop beating for a moment as I heard his footsteps move closer, the soft shuffle of his shoes across the floor. He didn't say anything at first. He didn't need to. The silence between us was thick, heavy with all the words we weren't saying. When I turned around to face him, I tried to keep my expression neutral, but I couldn't hide the tightness in my chest. His eyes flickered to mine, but there was no real warmth there. He didn't look sorry. He didn't even look guilty. "Hey," he said, his voice soft and almost casual, like nothing was wrong, like everything was just the way it should be. "How was your day?" I blinked at him, my throat tightening. "Oh, you know," I said, my voice coming out colder than I intended. "Same as always." I watched as his brow furrowed slightly, a frown tugging at the corners of his lips. He knew something was off. He could sense it, but he didn't ask. Of course he wouldn't. It wasn't like he cared anymore. "So what did you do today?" he asked, his eyes studying me. I could see the way his eyes darted to the kitchen, like he was already thinking about Lydia, thinking about the next time he would be there with her, fixing something or talking, or whatever it was they did when I wasn't around. The thought made my stomach churn, but I held it together, fighting to keep my voice steady. "I had a visitor today," I said, watching his reaction closely. His gaze flickered briefly, a shadow passing over his face. "A visitor? Who?" "Lydia," I said, and I didn't miss the slight hesitation in his eyes. His jaw tightened and his smile faltered just for a moment. "We had a nice chat. You know, about the house and things." He straightened up, trying to recover his composure. "I didn't know you two had been talking. Everything okay?" I smiled at him, but it wasn't a smile that would reassure him. It was sharp, like a knife tucked behind a calm expression. "Oh yeah," I said, dragging out the words. "Everything's just fine. In fact, she mentioned something interesting." He blinked at me, confusion creeping into his expression. What's that? She said you've been spending a lot of time over there lately, I said slowly, watching him carefully. A lot of time? More than you've been spending here with me. For a moment he just stared at me. His face twisted into something that wasn't quite surprise but more like a fleeting realization. He wasn't sure how much I knew, but I could tell it was starting to hit him. The weight of what he had been doing, the reality that I wasn't as clueless as he thought. I've just been helping her out, he said, his voice sounding defensive, like a man trying to convince himself as much as me. It's nothing. You know that. I could feel my pulse quickening, the anger bubbling up from deep within me. He was still lying. He was still trying to downplay it, trying to make it sound like nothing. Nothing. I repeated, a bitter laugh escaping my lips. So all the late nights, all the extra hours you've been spending over there. That's just nothing? He swallowed hard, his gaze flickering toward the floor, unable to meet my eyes. I didn't mean to. No. I cut him off, my voice sharp now, cutting through the air like a blade. Don't try to explain it away. I know what's been going on. I know exactly what you've been doing. I watched as he stiffened, his eyes flickering with something that almost looked like fear. Fear that I might know too much. Fear that he was about to lose everything. Is there something you want to tell me? I asked, my voice low but carrying the weight of everything that had built up between us. Because I think I already know the truth. He stood frozen, caught in the act, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of genuine guilt in his eyes. It was too little, too late, but it was something. You were right about one thing, I continued, my voice quieter now, almost as if I was speaking to myself. You've been so busy helping Lydia out. You haven't had time for me. You haven't had time for this marriage. I stood up, stepping closer to him, my eyes never leaving his. So now that I know what happens next, what do you think we do with this? He opened his mouth to speak, but the words never came. Instead, there was only the sound of the silence between us, thick and suffocating. The truth was out now, and there was no turning back. The only question left was whether he would finally face it, or if he would keep running. He didn't answer right away. I could see the hesitation in his eyes, the guilt clouding his usually calm demeanor. He looked at me as if he didn't know where to start, like the weight of his lies had suddenly become too much to bear. But instead of apologizing, instead of saying something, anything, that might begin to fix what he had broken, he simply stood there, his shoulders slumped. I wasn't sure what I was expecting. Maybe an apology, maybe an explanation. But instead, there was nothing but the sound of his shallow breath, as if he was trying to figure out how to talk his way out of a hole that had already swallowed him whole. My heart was pounding in my chest, but now it wasn't from fear. It was from anger, from the deep betrayal that was pulsing through my veins. I couldn't understand how he thought he could get away with it. For months I had watched the subtle shifts in his behavior, seen the signs of him growing more distant, more secretive, but I had never thought that he would cross the line like this. How could he do this to me? To us? Tell me the truth, I said, my voice shaking slightly, but there was no doubt in it. How long has this been going on? His eyes flickered. I saw the way he opened his mouth to speak, but the words caught in his throat. For a brief moment, I almost felt a small shred of sympathy for him. Maybe he was still trying to figure out how to make it all right. But that sympathy faded quickly. This wasn't about him anymore. It wasn't about his guilt. It was about me and the years I had spent trusting him, believing in him. How long, Michael? I pressed, my voice rising slightly. He let out a breath, his shoulders sagging further as if the burden of his dishonesty had finally taken a physical toll. He looked like a man who was out of answers, a man cornered by the truth. 2 months, he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. The words hit me like a punch to the stomach. I staggered back a step, my head spinning. 2 months. 2 months of him betraying me, lying to me, pretending everything was fine, while he was giving his attention to someone else. Someone who wasn't me. The anger that had been simmering inside me all afternoon exploded. 2 months. I repeated, my voice trembling with fury. You've been seeing her for 2 months, and you think you can just keep lying to me like this? His face twisted, the guilt clear now in his eyes, but there was no real apology. No regret. Just the awkward discomfort of a man caught in his own web of deceit. He was trying to explain himself, but every word that came out of his mouth just seemed to make everything worse. It wasn't like that, he said, his hands rising in a defensive gesture. I didn't mean for it to happen. I never meant to hurt you, but she needed help and I. Stop. I cut him off. I didn't want to hear it anymore. You think I don't know what's been going on? You think I can't see the way you've been running off to her? The way your eyes light up when you talk about her? How long did you think I wouldn't notice? That I wouldn't care? He opened his mouth to speak, but the words failed him. He was lost for a moment, as if he couldn't figure out where to begin to untangle the mess he had made. I never wanted to hurt you, he said again, his voice breaking, but it was hollow. Empty. Well, you did. I shot back, the sting of the words harsher than I intended. You hurt me more than you can ever imagine. I stepped away from him, pacing the room, my mind spinning. The house felt suffocating, the walls closing in as the realization of everything that had happened settled over me. I had been living a lie for months, trusting someone who had no intention of being faithful. I had built my world around a man who at best had stopped caring and at worst had been playing a part in a secret life behind my back. You should have told me, I whispered, the anger fading, replaced by something much heavier, sadness. You should have told me, Michael. I would have understood. I might have even helped. But you? I shook my head, trying to clear the fog in my mind. You just kept hiding it, like I'm too stupid to see. Like I'm not worth being honest with. He took a step toward me, but I held up my hand, stopping him. I didn't want to hear more excuses. I didn't want to hear anything from him right now. How did this even start? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He swallowed hard, his eyes flickering toward the floor. It just happened. I didn't plan for it. Lydia. She was just someone I was helping. But somewhere along the way, it became more. His words hung in the air like a thick fog. More. I was struggling to process it all. How did this happen? How did the man I married, the man I thought I knew, end up so entangled with someone else? Was it something I had missed? Was there a way I could have stopped it? But no. I couldn't focus on that now. The past was done. The truth was here, and now I had to decide what to do next. I turned back toward him, my heart breaking. So that's it then. You've made your choice. He looked at me, his expression conflicted, his body tense, but he didn't respond immediately. It was like he was still trying to make sense of it all, still trying to figure out what he had done. But I didn't need an answer. I already knew what his answer was. It was clear in the way he had been behaving for months. It was clear in the way he had kept his distance from me, in the way his eyes had started to wander toward her. It was clear in the way I could sense that somewhere along the line I had stopped being enough for him. I don't even know who you are anymore, I said, my voice breaking. I couldn't even recognize the man standing in front of me. He wasn't the man I had married. He wasn't the man who had promised to love me through thick and thin, to be there for me when things got tough. He was a stranger, someone who had chosen to lie to me, to deceive me, to destroy everything we had built together. And the worst part was, he had done it so easily, like it didn't even matter. He finally spoke again, his voice almost pleading. Please, just let me explain. No. I shook my head, cutting him off. I don't want to hear it anymore. I don't want your explanations. I don't want your excuses. I just want to be done with this. The tears that had been threatening to spill finally broke free, rolling down my cheeks, though I didn't even try to wipe them away. I wasn't going to hide how much this hurt. Not for him, not anymore. I looked at him one last time, seeing the confusion and the guilt in his eyes. But it didn't matter anymore. The damage had been done. The trust that had been the foundation of our relationship had been shattered beyond repair. And I knew that I couldn't fix it. I want you to leave, I said, the words coming out more firmly than I expected. Now. He didn't move. For a moment he just stood there, frozen in place, as if waiting for something to change. But I didn't wait for him to make up his mind. I turned away from him, walking toward the door. I wasn't going to let this drag on any longer. I wasn't going to sit here and let him play the victim. I'm done, I said, barely above a whisper, before stepping out into the hallway. I heard him behind me taking a step toward me, but I didn't look back. I had nothing left to say to him. I didn't know what would happen next. I didn't know if he would leave or if he would try to fight for our marriage. But in that moment I realized something. It didn't matter. Whatever came next, I would be okay. Because I wasn't going to be the woman who stayed in a broken marriage, pretending everything was fine, pretending I didn't know the truth. I walked out of the house, feeling like the weight of the world had been lifted off my shoulders. The future was uncertain, but one thing was clear. I was done being the person who was kept in the dark. I was done with the lies. And whatever came next, I would face it on my own terms. I stepped outside, feeling the cool air hit my face, but it didn't bring the relief I was hoping for. The sharp sting in my chest was still there, a constant reminder of what had just happened. My mind raced through every moment, every conversation, every second I'd spent trying to ignore the things that were happening right under my nose. The whole world felt like it had shifted on its axis, leaving me with the uncomfortable feeling of disorientation, like I was walking through life with a veil over my eyes that had suddenly been ripped off. I couldn't decide if I felt numb or just broken. There was a heaviness in my chest that refused to lift, like an anchor tethered to my soul. I wasn't ready to face the aftermath yet, but it was impossible to ignore. The weight of the situation, the reality of what had just unfolded in front of me, was unbearable. Michael was in there, still in the house, still pretending that the life we'd built together hadn't crumbled to dust in the span of a few minutes. I walked aimlessly, the steps taking me further from the house, away from the scene of the confrontation. The neighborhood around me was quiet, peaceful even, but there was no peace in my mind. I could still feel the echoes of his words, the desperation in his voice when he tried to explain himself. But I didn't need his explanations anymore. I knew the truth that hurt more than anything he could ever say to justify his actions. As I walked, I kept thinking about Lydia, about what she had said to me earlier that day. How she'd smiled at me with those eyes that held too many secrets, how she had reassured me that things weren't as bad as they seemed. She had played the innocent card, but now, knowing everything I did, I could see through her facade. She wasn't as innocent as she wanted me to believe. And she wasn't just some naive woman who had been caught up in something that spiraled out of control. No, Lydia had known exactly what she was doing. She had known exactly what kind of hold she had over Michael, and she wasn't letting go.